everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to gather fabric. Now I know this is something that seems pretty straightforward and like, duh, we all know how to gather fabric, but you know what? Not everybody maybe knows how to gather fabric. So this is going to be in direct relation to the Chelsea party dress, my new pattern. And this is the skirt piece we're going to be working on, and we are going to gather it in to go into the waistband piece. So to gather fabric, you want to set your machine at a long stitch length. The longest stitch length that it'll go on. For me, that's a 4, and you are going to want to remind yourself not to backstitch. You want that stitch to be loose and pullable, and we're going to go around the whole top opening of the skirt in one fell swoop. And this is going to differ depending on what your seam allowances is. For me, my pattern seam allowances are a 1/2 inch, so I like to go around at first 1/8 inch and then a 1/4 inch from there. So altogether that is 3/8 inch, which will still be inside my seam allowance. You don't want any of your gathering stitches really to show unless you plan on pulling them out, which is a big pain in the butt. So you don't want them to show once you sew your skirt or whatever it is to the waistband or whatever you're stitching to. So I am going to start first by at the opening. We're going to go all the way around. So this is the zipper opening at the center back. I'm going to clip these serger threads to get them out of the way. And I am going to first from the edge do my first stitch all the way around. And again, this is a 1/8 inch stitch, and notice as the fabric is coming out of the back, if you're working with a lighter weight fabric and you have a longer stitch length, it's going to naturally want to gather that fabric for you. Granted, you're still going to have to do some of the gathering yourself, but it is a little bit helpful that it kind of starts to gather for you. And there are fancy presser feet and things that can help you out. A lot of people also like the dental floss method, which is simply doing a zigzag stitch over a strip of dental floss, or I just use often a thicker piece of thread, which works great. I use this a lot if I'm gathering two layers of fabric together, but it is not super awesome for making sure all your gathers are even whenever you're sewing. They can tend to clump in one place or another, and it's hard to control. So there is our first stitch, and now from that first stitch I'm going to go back and do my second stitch, and I'm using my first stitch as a guide. So I'm sewing a 1/2 inch, a 1/4 inch away from that first stitch, which is essentially the width of my presser foot. So I am lining up my presser foot with the stitching in my first stitch that I did across the top of this dress. And I know it's hard to see completely in the video. I'm gonna, once I'm done, do a little close-up for you, hopefully, so you can see at the end a little better what's happened. And again, I know a lot of you maybe already know how to do this, but you might not. And so I thought it would be helpful to do a little video if you're not familiar with gathering, which, by the way, is one of my least favorite things to do. I don't know about you. Again, don't forget not to backstitch at the beginning or the end of this stitch. You want to leave the stitch loose, and you want to have a long thread tail hanging. I forgot to mention that part earlier, but you want a nice, good Here you can see me pulling a nice good thread tail. So here's a nice close-up for you, and this is what your finished gathering stitches are going to look like. 2 rows about 1/4 of an inch apart, and you can see where my machine was kind of already gathering that in. Now you want to pay attention, so I did those stitches with the right side of my fabric facing up, which means that my bobbin thread is on the wrong side, and you always want to pull the bobbin thread. If you pull the top thread, you are going to have trouble with the gathering part. So I'm fishing out my 2 bobbin threads. They got a little bit tangled up together, so on one of my edges I'm just trying to separate the bobbin threads from the top threads. And there we go. And then you're simply just going to pull, and what you're really doing is you're holding on to the bobbin thread while you are scrunching the fabric down onto the thread. You're not really pulling the thread, or in another sense you could be holding the fabric in place while you pull the bobbin thread, but I really like to think of it as you're squishing the fabric down the length of the thread. And you'll notice I did this all in one go. I did my stitching all the way across my side seams and everything. If you're working with a thicker fabric, you may need to stop at the side seams. This fabric is super light and drapey, so I just went straight across them, and I'm gathering through them just fine. But if you are working with thicker fabric or multiple layers of fabric that you're gathering all together, you will definitely want to stop your gathering or shearing stitches, as they're also called, at the side seam and start a separate set of gathering stitches for the front piece, or just anywhere that a seam is broken up. And I'm sorry that was off screen for a little bit, but I just moved it back on screen so you guys can see a little bit better. And what you want to do is alternate. As you can see, I'm alternating sides. I started on one side and I'm going to go the other side. You want to make the gathering as even as possible. You don't want it to be super gathered in one area or not so gathered in another area. You want it to look very even and streamlined, unless of course it's intentional. I know a lot of people that don't put any gathering at their side seams to eliminate that bulk at the sides, or you could maybe concentrate more gathering towards the front if you were doing, say, a maternity dress, or more gathering towards the back if you want a little more room for your caboose. It's really up to you, but in general you want the gathering to be as even as possible. And depending on how much fabric you're working with, how big your pattern pieces are, this could be a very time-intensive process, hence why it's not my favorite. Again, there are other methods. There's the zigzag method, which works great, but it doesn't really hold that shearing in a uniform way, and when you're sewing it, it tends to just wiggle around. You have to hold it in place a lot more. This method really holds once you've gotten the shearing, the gathering where you want it, and it's all even. Here you can see where it's kind of bunching up in places, and I'm evening that out. Once you get it where you want it, it generally will stay in that space. And you're going to want to constantly be checking this with your pattern piece. So undoubtedly you have notches that need to be matched up. And once I like to start off and get a nice gather going before I bother trying to match up my knot, because it's easier to gather without all those pins holding your notches in place. Now, as you will see, you can still gather whenever everything is pinned in place. It's just a little bit trickier. So right now I didn't do a very good job of marking my notches prior to all this gathering, which I highly recommend because now I'm looking through my gathering for my notches. And so I am going to match up all my notches and go ahead and pin those. And another quick tip is that I am not pinning directly into the edge because it'll be easier for me to gather if I pin a little bit below my stitch point or the edge of this fabric. I have pinned all my notches in place, and that's going to show me how much more I need to gather. And just a reminder, with this dress in particular, you're only gathering to the self side of your waistband. You want that lining side folded back and you're pinning to the self side. And as you can see, I have now finished all my gathering, and in between each of my pins or my notches, my gathering exactly matches the length of the waistband, which is what we want. You don't want any additional puckering because that's going to give you like a weird extra pleat looking gather. So you just want to pull it all in, continue scrunching down that fabric, and then go back around, make it all nice and even, and then you are going to stitch it to the waistband or whatever you're stitching it to, all the way around. I find it helpful to stitch with the gathers facing up, just can control any weird bunching that might happen, so you're not taking up any more fabric than you want to be. If you have a walking foot, you may find it helpful if you're trying to gather thicker fabric just to get that those ruffles through your sewing machine. But for this particular dress, it's very lightweight. The fabric is very lightweight, so my regular foot works just fine. And you're going to stitch at your regular stitch length this time, and you're going to back stitch. You want this to be your final stitch that really holds everything in place. And this is what it looks like when you're done. Nice even stitches all the way around, even gathers. And you can see from the front, there aren't any weird pleat-like puckers or anything like that. It just looks like even gathering all the way across, which is exactly what you want whenever you do gathers. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you are new to gathering, or if you just were stuck at this step in the Chelsea party dress sewing process, thank you so much for joining me. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and happy sewing! Be sure to check out my other tutorials in my tutorials playlist. Bye!